What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Sands of Salzaar. Right at the beginning of the video, just to answer a couple of questions, I review games after 100% to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube and lend me some credibility. My Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. You're more than welcome to check it out. And while these reviews do include the achievements, they also include more than the achievements. And if you're curious and unsubscribed and you go to my channel, the first video you're going to see is a video explaining everything I cover. Now, jumping in from there, Sands of Salzaar is a pretty interesting game. It is an indie title from developer Han Squirrel Studio. The game itself is sort of an open world strategy game meets action RPG. You will often see comparisons to things like Mountain Blade, Kenshi in some respects as well, actually, and a few others. Now, despite those things, I think that this particular game manages to be unique, at least in the culmination of all of its efforts. Now, before we start diving into the rest of this review, I do want to mention right here at the beginning that the game itself is just $15 over on Steam, which is something I want you to keep in mind as we discuss the rest of this. So, first of all, let's start with the plot setup. I'm not going to give out anything that is particularly spoilery, but I do want to cover the story setup a bit. Prior to the events of the game, there was a war about 20 years back, known as the War of the Black Sun. This sort of heralded destruction, and as the game actually kicks off 20 years later, the land starts being invaded by creatures known as Ifrit, which are sort of like fire demons, you can think of them as. And as you might imagine, the broad strokes of the game is that you want to stop this from happening. Now, this can end a couple different ways. You have to play through the game a few times to see the true ending, if you will, as the game has a bit of a cyclical nature to the story itself. Now, my broad opinion, if you will, is that the story is okay. I would tell you it's not amazing, it's not going to blow you away or anything, but it's serviceable. I will tell you at times it can feel a little disjointed from the rest of the game due to the sort of open-ended nature of the gameplay and how you advance the story. And just point blank, the story itself is a bit anime, quite frankly, as you probably could tell by the art style, etc. So something to keep in mind there, I suppose. Honestly, the story of a game like this, in my opinion, is negligible. Not to say that it's not important, some people are going to play it for that, but I would tell you that most of the gameplay is more about the strategy elements and managing your presence on the map. When we actually go to fire up the game, we have to pick between story versus sandbox mode. Now, sandbox mode is essentially the strategy part of the game and the combat minus the actual story. It still kind of happens more or less the same in that the Ifrit will occasionally attack the map and you'll have to deal with that. But beyond that, the story elements are removed and you can just focus on the strategy part. And story mode, if you will, is the mode that actually just lets you see the story, not to be confused with story difficulty, as this game does not have that. Now, story mode has available normal, hard, and epic difficulty, whereas sandbox mode only lets you pick between hard and epic. Now, the difference between all of those is primarily troop availability and whether or not they disband when defeated. So if you're defeated in combat, or more specifically, some of your troop units are defeated in combat, if that unit actually hits 0 out of whatever many units, the entire troop just disappears and you don't get to replenish them normally, as opposed to them just getting injured and you giving them a healing item or something. And then the other part of that is that the availability of the types of troops is also diminished a little bit. So this is a fairly high fantasy game in some respects, and because of that, some of the troops available to you are things that are more fantastical in nature, like dragons, demons, etc. And on the higher difficulties, the availability of those more fantastical creatures is lessened. Now, once you've got that sorted out, you can jump into character creation. This is actually pretty important, though the choices themselves are relatively simple. There are a handful of classes you can pick from, but you are picking more than you realize probably at first glance, as some of these classes come with their own unique set of plot quests, which mean that some of these classes have their own separate plot that you can advance. In addition to this, as you might imagine, each class has separate abilities, etc. that they have access to just normally, and then last but not least, some of these classes actually have unique modifiers to the game in some way. For instance, the Knight Errant starts with the entire map hating them, and thus it's very hard for them to gain that initial foothold. And because of this, you'll see a difficulty rating associated with each class from 1 to 3 stars. Now, if you're playing this for the first time, you should go Spiritmancer. Spiritmancer is kind of considered the default experience. Their plot quest actually has multiple outcomes as well, but if you don't know where to start, pick Spiritmancer. It's kind of considered the beginner experience. Now, beyond that, let's talk about a few others. As I mentioned, the Knight Errant starts with the entire map hating them, meaning that they'll be attacked on sight by all of the default factions. That's hard to work around, but not impossible, something to keep in mind there. That said, I would say the Sultan is probably the most unique, as the Sultan actually starts with a faction already ready to go. They start with their own little village that they need to be in charge of, and in fact, some of their advancement is tied to upgrading this village. So if you're looking for a unique starting point, the Sultan is probably the most in that regard. Though, as a result, they also do start with more resources, but because they have a village, that village is prone to being attacked by enemy factions as well, which can be a little hit or miss with the RNG. And then last but not least, we have the Nameless. The Nameless is kind of like hard mode. You can't even pick this class on your first run through the game. You have to beat the game and then it becomes available. And this is primarily because the Nameless works a bit differently than the other classes. The Nameless is essentially a blank slate. Using a legacy shop, which we're just about to talk about, you'll actually pick the ability trees that this particular character has access to by spending legacy points on them, and this will allow you to essentially make a completely custom character by combining other classes, but this combined with a couple other modifiers means that playing this class is very difficult and you kind of need to understand the game before you give it a go. Now, before we finish up character creation, you do get to make an avatar for your character if you want. This is the sort of paper doll sprite that will show up in conversations as you talk. Each class has their own unique avatar that you can just choose to roll with. That is the class picture that you see when you picked the class. However, if you want to make a unique one, you can, and then you can also choose a unique sprite for your character as well that will actually show up on the map as you move around. So just a little extra there. Now let's talk Legacy Shop. As I mentioned, this game has a bit of a cyclical nature to it, and it is designed to be replayed. So as you play through the game and you accomplish certain feats, you earn what are called legacy points. You can spend these on all sorts of things when you start a new game to enhance your experience in some way. Now, if you picked the Nameless one, you literally have to buy the skill trees that you want to use. No other class can pick those, by the way, but other classes can pick individual little extra skills that they can pick up to use in combat, so that's something to keep in mind. You can also do things like recruit heroes to start the game with you. This is something that is available in the regular game, but requires more work, and with legacy points, you can just start out with these people on your side and in your party, basically, which can make combat much easier if you choose to go that route with your legacy points. And then probably the most important thing to know about the Legacy Shop is the difficulty setting. So if the base difficulties aren't enough for you, you can choose to pick the difficulty option at the Legacy store. Now, each increasing level of difficulty requires you to beat the game, basically. So if you beat the game at difficulty 1, you can add an extra point, if you will, of difficulty at the Legacy Shop. This will increase things like your starting level as well as the level cap in game. The base level cap is 20. Every difficulty that you pick in the Legacy Shop increases this by an extra 5. This actually has no cap. You can do this as much as you want, which does make the game scale for quite a while. Though, honestly, I don't know many people that would play this forever in that regard, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. In addition to all of those things, we can also grab just extra, more useful stuff like items to start the game with, extra gold, extra limits on our troops, etc. It's just a really helpful way to start the game. Now let's talk progression a little bit. So your character, as you might imagine, is going to level up by doing activities, engaging in battles, etc. As I mentioned, the level cap is dictated by the difficulty that you have completed the game on and thus chose in the Legacy Shop. But the important things to know about progressing in this game is, of course, your characters, yourself and whatever heroes you've managed to convince to come along with you, and your troops. Now, when you level up, the primary thing you're going to notice is skills. So skills essentially work like talent trees. These will augment your combat abilities in a way that is pretty straightforward. What you see is what you get. You'll get new abilities, improve those abilities as you level up. And then there are talents. Talents affect your sort of entire party, your army, if you will, that you're going to be using in combat here and there. This will do things like increase the XP that they get, make them more effective in combat, make them move faster on the map, that type of stuff. So when you level up, you get talent points that you get to spend on this stuff as well. Now, your troops will gain experience the longer they're alive with you every week or so, and they will also increase in level up to the level cap. However, their progression works a bit differently as they level up and hit certain milestones. They can, if you have the resources, be upgraded into new higher tier units that are, of course, stronger. And this is an important way to grow your army. So from there, let's actually talk gameplay. What does this thing look like? So the entire point of the game really is to explore the Sands of Salzaar and take everything over either through force or diplomacy, really. Your three options when dealing with other factions, to put it rather simply, is basically attack them, outtrade them, or talk them down, or, become allies with them. Now, while you're doing this, days are passing, so that's something important to note. And I would tell you that when you actually start the game, it does give you a tiny tutorial of sorts. However, it is very quick and does not give you a lot of information. In fact, the literal tutorial is a little bare bones, which leads to one of my main criticisms of this game. You're going to lose a lot of people right at the beginning, because this game is pretty deep in terms of its systems. Like, truthfully, I probably won't be able to hit them all in much detail here, or would be here for probably an hour. But there's a lot of systems, and the game doesn't do a great job of easing you into the world, because while, again, there is a main story, how your character progresses is very open-ended. They just kind of dump you into the overall map, which is set, by the way. The map is the map. And they kind of let you pick what zone you want to start in, but beyond that, you just kind of get dumped into the map, and then you're kind of just expected to know what to do. And with enough fumbling around, you will figure it out. But I do think that in this one regard, they would have been better off giving a more structured start to the game until you either join a faction or start your own faction, because that's when the game kind of really kicks off. Because in order to explore and take over the Sands of Salzaar, you're going to have to deal with the other factions. There are 5 factions that are kind of set in stone, who are kind of like the other tribes, if you will. And then there are some minor factions that are essentially just enemies that will randomly attack you, like on the road while you're traveling, that type of stuff. But the beginning of the game, your focus should really be either joining one of the tribes by doing them a lot of favors, by doing little side quests for them, and thus increasing your diplomatic rating with that faction. And I believe it's 10, you're allowed to join them, at which point that will dictate your relationship with the other factions, friend or foe, and then you can kind of go from there using diplomacy, etc. Or if you want to go the war route, you can just start your own faction and start taking everybody over. Now, of course, you can do this in a more emergent gameplay way. Say you could join one faction, get tired of them, leave them, join another, declare war on your old faction, that type of stuff. So there's as many options there as you care to make use of, honestly. And in that way, again, the game is very deep in that regard. There's a lot of systems around this stuff. But broadly speaking, I would say the game is split up into story quests, plot quests, side quests, and then exploration and stuff. So story quests, pretty straightforward. Usually there's a level requirement of sorts to advance this, but how you get there is really up to you. Then there are the plot quests. These are class specific. And truth be told, in my opinion, that's some of the most interesting stuff in the game, and some of the most varied gameplay available here comes from the plot quests. And then there are side quests. These are very small jobs, usually to just go explore a dungeon or something, or a point of interest and use your troops to do it, that type of stuff. More often than not, they're pretty basic. A couple of them are pretty good. But yes, there are side quests available. And then beyond that, we are exploring. And one of the big things to keep in mind when exploring is who is in charge of the territory you're in and who controls the towns and villages. These towns and villages will have buildings that you can use, and will all have little sub-menus that do all little sorts of unique things. For instance, keeps are going to have merchants, inns, there's a little brawler guild side activity thing that they added. This is where you'll recruit troops from a faction in particular, because remember, you're in charge of a bunch of troops. And if you should, by force or diplomacy, take over a town, the buildings that are associated in that town, and you can build more in some cases, but those buildings are going to generate resources. You're going to use those resources to, of course, purchase things from merchants, etc., or use them to upgrade your troops if it's time to do that. And overall, I think this is a lot of great gameplay that leads to a lot of learning. However, it's, again, hard to learn all of it because the game is a bit of a menu hell, especially for a new player. There's just so much to know, and the game does a bad job of conveying it to you. Now, it's not insurmountable. Most of the stuff is pretty simple once you learn about it, but it's getting to the point that you know about it that is difficult. Now, beyond all that stuff, as you're you're roaming the world and, building up your troops, etc. You want to look out for points of interest and dungeons, basically. These are where you're going to go into an area and actually engage in combat. So points of interest can be all sorts of stuff. These can be bandit camps out in the world that you need to take over, or just smaller, like little one-off type things. And all of this stuff requires a certain amount of in-game days to sort of reset. But more often than not, you can do all of this stuff more than once. And then there are the dungeons. These are usually text events, in that a text event will pop up, kind of tell you what's going on. And then if there's combat, it'll bring you to a little combat arena for it. In some cases, you and your army will be fighting. In other cases, it's just your heroes. So a little bit of variance here as well. In addition to this, there's even more world bosses that are just kind of hanging out on the map that are like super difficult encounters for just your character. And if you can believe it, I've only really scratched the surface of systems here. This game is deep, which is crazy for a game that is $15. But from here, let's talk about combat a little bit. Now, combat, unfortunately, is where I think this game drops the ball a little bit. It starts out strong enough. You're going to be controlling your main hero, of course, using your associated abilities. There's a hotbar, there's healing items, consumables, there's equipment. There's enough that goes into it to make it interesting. The problem is when you get to the late game and you start having army battles. The battles that include just your heroes usually stay pretty manageable, but later on, you might be sieging a town or something, and you're going to have all of these units on the battlefield all at once, and it is just a chaotic mess, and it's very hard to know what is going on or try to apply any sort of tactics to it. And because of this, late game, it kind of feels like these battles are won just by sheer force of number than anything approaching any kind of strategy. But as I've alluded to multiple times, you will be recruiting troops. This is done a few different ways, so it's hard to give like any solid advice, but I would say the most common way is going up to a faction area and then heading to the keep and then just hitting the recruit option. You can spend some of your resources to recruit mercenaries from that faction. You can also find mercenaries just out and about. You can also buy beast units, things like animals, etc. There are places later on in the game, a little more late game, where you can find fantastical creatures like demons, phoenixes, dragons. Some of that stuff is available later. And overall, as the game progresses, you can add more and more units to your particular party. And there is a bit of a progression involved in all of this. But again, late game, the combat is just a bit of a mess, and it's hard to follow a lot of what's going on outside of the fights where it's just your character. Last but not least, before we start hitting positives and negatives and wrapping this thing up, is romances. Believe it or not, there are romances in this game, if there wasn't enough to talk about. Now, honestly, they're super bare bones. I wouldn't get too excited. In some of the towns, I believe it is, there are keeps, and I think there's 5 in total, where there's like a bartender type lady, and if you give this woman enough gifts, which can be found through exploring, and if you give them gifts they like, it'll raise your favor, and eventually you can start a relationship with them. And you get unique items in return for doing this. But given the nature of conversations and stuff in this game, it's, again, very bare bones. I wouldn't expect too much out of it. From there, positives and negatives. Positives. There is a ton of content here, a ton of room for emergent gameplay. There's a ton of systems all interacting with each other, and that can lead to some really fun situations. And as I mentioned, those systems run pretty deep. There is a lot to know, there's a lot to learn, and for a game that is very cheap, you could easily get 100 plus hours out of this if you really wanted to. Now, on the negative side, as I mentioned, late game combat, again, bit of a mess. Real hit or miss. I guess some people might like it, but I wasn't a fan. Most of it, I just won by gathering so much force the enemy didn't have a chance anyway, because micromanaging any of it was just impossible. And then the other big criticism I have is that, again, the game needs a better intro. My suggestion would be to, again, put the beginning of the game a bit more on rails until you have the decision to, join up with a faction or actually make your own, and just kind of show you what options are available for you before just dumping you into the world with no idea what to do, which I think is something that turns a lot of people off from this game. And while luckily, a lot of these systems are relatively simple, like once you find them and know about them, they're relatively easy to learn, but the game does a poor job of, letting you know that they're there. So a little bit of structure, I think, would go a long way. But in conclusion, Sands of Salzaar is a weird title in a lot of ways. There's a lot of combinations of mechanics I've seen elsewhere. The combat, again, especially late game, is pretty objectively bad. The English localization is a little rough in places as well, which is something they're actively working on. By the time people watch this review, it's possible that an update has fixed that already. They are working on that. But more than anything, Sands of Salzaar is a janky indie experience that can be a lot of fun and has a surprisingly robust depth of its systems that for $15, I think is an absolute buy. This is a game I would have happily paid $30 for, honestly. But for $15, I think that's a price that is going to help a lot of people overlook its flaws, of which there are certainly a few. But there you go, everyone. My review after 100% for Sands of Salzaar, one of the more interesting titles I've played over the years, to be sure. I certainly hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. We are growing every day. I do this thing pretty consistently, so if you want to see me review more games, or maybe you want to check out the playlist of the things I've already reviewed. But regardless of any of that, thank you again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.